Professor Winston, it's fascinating to be reminded of the historical connection between media, news organizations, and religion since before the founding of the country as a republic. But it's today so interesting that in our presidential contests, the last one, the one before that, and this one in particular, it's almost as if we have a party of religion and a party of anti-religion, and we have media not limited only to print media, but media that seems to elevate ridicule of religious attitudes or religious-based or philosophy-based political principles. There's a level of venom in the media today and in our country that's simmering, and it's a very important current that, let's say, energizes political behavior, energizes the sale of television advertising, and energizes the sale of newspapers and magazines. So do you have a comment about that connection, the relationship? Are we more political today, more religious, media conflicted, you think, perhaps, than previously?
If you could look at some of the newspaper coverage of the Scopes trial, it was very venomous, and the depictions of religious believers in some of the Eastern newspapers was very cutting and very, the Scopes trial is what I'm thinking about. I mean, these people were treated as buffoons, ignoramuses, and, it was a level. I mean, they said they were they spoke more elegantly, perhaps, in their insults, but the degree of hostility and the cultural dismissiveness of religious believers was, as I think, it was almost more belittling than what you would have today, because today a reporter would never speak of a fundamentalist of any persuasion in such clear, with such clear, venom and hatred and disgust. I mean, it might be packaged a little differently and it would be a subtler. I'm not talking about talk radio. That's a whole different ballgame. But in newspapers or magazines, if you're going to cut down your opponent, you don't do it in such an overt way. To me, the question, though, is, why do we see reporting about some kinds of religious people all the time and reporting on other kinds of religious people so rarely? And, why do we see some stories about religion consistently and other stories, as Father Heff said, so infrequently? I think that in the 1970s, the press were very enamored of the religious right because they were the new big thing. And to find religious people who are willing to come up with these crazy sound bites, like, AIDS is a punishment from God, or, AIDS is a punishment for feminism. I mean, reporters liked that because they were very catchy and quotable. And I think in the last 30 or 40 years, somehow the religious right has come to dominate the narrative, and so everything they do seems newsy and nothing else. They've become the authentic religious voice for this country, according to the media. And it's hard for anyone else to fight them, especially when they say, well, we're telling you what the Bible says. And obviously, if you're a reporter, if someone's quoting the Bible, they must be authentically religious. So, it's a whole package that's been bought right now. And I think it's hard to break through that, and it's hard for a religious liberal or a religious moderate who isn't waving the Bible and, is saying, my professor, my minister told me, or my common sense tells me, or my church teaching. it doesn't sound as authoritative as it, the Bible. So I think this whole idea of who's the authentic religious leader is a problem, because oftentimes some people claim authenticity and authority, and other people don't know how to fight about it, or they don't want to fight about it. So I just think we've gotten into a cycle of privileging some people as religious leaders and not seeing others. Does that make any sense? And unfortunately, some of the people who have been privileged are people who do speak in very radical terms about what's right and what's wrong. And one of the problems with why I think the debate about the Catholic teachings on birth control and reproduction have gotten so much heat these days is because rather than have someone explain it who is knowledgeable, some of the talk show hosts got hold of it and began spewing a lot of stuff that was very inflammatory but very sexy to readers, or allegedly sexy. And so the issue became who can make the wildest story possible. And the Catholic bishops, that's not what they're about. So I think it's really terrible, in word.
You mentioned about the rise of papers. I think it went from like 3,000 to 7,000, and now who knows how many papers and magazines and all sorts of things that we have, reading materials. Do you see, what do you see for the future for newspapers? Because I was sitting here thinking, I have 4 adult children, all married with children. I think one family takes a Sunday LA Times. I think of 2 other families that do not take a paper. And I'm not sure about the third because he lives in Reno. But they're all using the internet, for their news. And I'm just wondering, are these papers, are they going to go out of business? Or what do you think is the future of, and all the magazines that we get in the markets or anywhere that you go to look for a magazine is rather confusing to even know what to pick up. And they're very costly. Some of these things that come are very costly. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
If I really knew the answer to that question, I would be like a marketing genius. And Mark Zuckerberg would be my best friend. But honestly, as I think about it as an historian, even though I don't think print papers are going to be around much longer. I think they have 5 or 10 years. It's not cost effective to deliver them to your house anymore. Every paper you get would love to be online and not be a hard copy. The problem is that most of the money still comes in advertising in print, because it's much more expensive to advertise in print than it is to advertise online.
Expensive or cheaper? You said it's much more expensive.
Papers make more money with print ads than they do with online ads.
Okay, you said it was more expensive than you said it was cheaper.
Yeah, I meant it's more, papers charge more for print ads than they do they can get away with charging more for print ads and traditionally, newspapers make their money from advertisements. They haven't made money for circulation for a long time. In fact, it's a joke when you're a reporter that, you're writing around the ads, basically, because it's the ads that are the heart of the paper. And how much space you have at any given time to write a story depends upon how much ads were sold, and so that, decides what the copy is. More people than ever read the LA Times. Their circulation, if you look online, millions of people are reading it every day, whereas before maybe it had, 150, 200,000. That's the tremendous irony of it, that papers are more important now than ever before because they're all online and they have circulation, they have readerships of millions. And the joke is that newspapers are so busy cutting back on content and reporters, they're taking away the product that is most essential and that makes them what they are. The big problem is, though, they're not monetized, and so no one's figured out how to, take those millions of eyeballs and turn them into money. A lot of newspapers are trying to set up the firewall again, which means, you have to pay for content. In the past, that hasn't worked. I suppose that if enough papers do it and people get used to it, maybe we will be rebelling against it, but our children and grandchildren will be perfectly fine with the idea. I do think that we are headed for a period more like the one I described earlier, where newspapers are kept afloat by people who wanted to subscribe to them. And so just like you pay now, or people pay for NPR, they pay to their local stations, people will begin paying more to local newspapers. And it will be more, you won't have a subscription necessarily, but you will know that I want to give $100 to the LA Times and maybe $200 to the New York Times and maybe $30 to a local LA microsite. But I think it's going to be that kind of arrangement where people eventually feel like they need to pay online, which they're not used to doing. And hopefully then news organizations will start hiring back reporters, because they can't hope anyone will want to pay for them when they have just junk in them.
In my naive idealism, I keep wanting to ask, do you see a role for the media in leading a national conversation on important topics? With all the competing interests that editors have to face and all that, has that been any part of their calculus? Is there a realistic way in which that can happen? For example, we have this furor now in Florida over the killing of the black teenager. The issues that raises are important for us as a society. Is there any hope to get beyond the titillation, the outrage and all that, to have a serious conversation? I just use that as an example.
But see, you're asking the question that ministers were asking at the end of the 19th century. Can't newspapers use their political and social capital for good? And newspapers are basically capitalist institutions, and they care about the market. So I suppose if they saw, an economic reason to be like that, they might, but that's not what they're about. They're not about altruism. One of the biggest shifts in newspaper publishing that occurred in the 70s and 80s was, once upon a time, newspapers were often owned by families, and families tended to have more noblesse oblige and more concern for their local communities. And even though the families wanted to make money, they also felt a sense of civic responsibility. In the 80s, as costs began to escalate because of paper costs in particular and personnel costs, more and more families got out of the business that they began selling to newspaper chains and to multinationals. So you have newspapers owned by, GE or by ABC or Cap Cities. They don't care about the local community. They care about making money. So it's not in their interest necessarily to do the kind of work you're talking about. They don't want to offend people, but they don't necessarily feel like they have to buy in to make the world a better place. So I think the changing economics of newspaper ownership really had a big impact on newspaper responsibility to local communities. That said, in the early 1990s, there was a move called public journalism that tried to encourage news outlets to be more involved with the community and take a leadership role. And the idea was that they would generate more positive feelings about what they did, and they'd also develop better penetration into communities if they were seen as community players. Some newspapers liked that idea, and some TV stations liked the idea, but most of them felt that it got in the way with their objectivity and that it was sending the wrong message because they looked like they were involved where they should be aloof. So there was some success in some communities, but it didn't catch on. Newspapers these days try to be part of a cultural conversation. So you have the LA Times sponsoring the book fair here, and in New York you have the New York Times has cultural conversations. But that seems to be as far as they want to go. They seem to be more content with safer topics, than with cutting edge ones.
In the description that we had, it talks about that you give an overview of the relationship between religion and journalism, and then it would offer an assessment of the challenges. To me, I feel all the journalism and the telejournalism is reduced to sound bites. How does that affect the news and the newsworthiness of the topics?
The challenge of journalism today is basically where do you want to get your news? And you can go to online sites and there's anything but sound bites. I mean, if you look at the BBC, for example, you see long, in-depth articles with lots of additional information that goes on and on about the whole context of the situation.
But that's the European thing you talked about.
Right. You could, the New York Times does similar work also. NPR is trying to do the same thing. I mean, I think if you want to invest the time into getting in-depth coverage and not sound bites, you can do that. The problem is that most of us don't have 5 hours a day to really read deeply into the news and to get beyond sound bites. So right now, in the desire to grab people's attention, news managers have made the calculus that sensational sound bites are what does it. Either people will stop responding to them and they'll realize something has to change, or something will happen in society that makes them realize that, this is a stupid way to do it. But given the nature of the amount of time they have to capture people's attention, whether it's a headline or something you hear on the radio, they're going to go for the gut. And unfortunately, that's often the most salacious soundbite you can imagine.
There's a lot more that could be said on this topic, but we don't want to keep Professor Winston all night. So if you join me in thanking Professor Winston. Thank you.